Okay, we have some yeses, okay, great. Okay, so let's get started with this. And maybe just before we begin today, hello, beautiful people of Amy. Welcome to our webinar tonight on something very exciting and dear to our heart, which is gaming. And I'm super excited to have this opportunity to talk with you today and to share, something we're really passionate about. So we're going to be talking about gaming today. Was my great friend Eric. We've known each other for quite a while now, and I'm always amazed by the kind of things that he's doing. And hopefully today we'll get a little bit more in depth into this topic, and we will be discussing some more details about gaming in education. And I think with that, let's perhaps get started. I'm going to share my slides now, and let's get going with this. Here we go. Share this, and let's put in presentation mode. And I'm going to give Eric, I'm going to give you some remote access to this. Okay, very good. So again, welcome to all of you. My name is Daniel Salcedo. I'm the co-chair of the Technology Enhanced Learning Committee, and I'm the director of the Center of Clinical Medical Education at Taipei Municipal Wanfang Hospital, and I'm also the Director of Innovation and Research at our Simulation Center at Taipei Medical University. And with me today is my great friend, Eric. Eric, I'll let you read because you have so many letters after your name. I'll let you do that part.
Yeah, so I'm Eric Gantwerker. I'm the associate professor at the Zucker School of Medicine, Northwell Health in Hofstra. I'm a pediatric otolaryngologist by training, and I also work as a medical director of a video game company, medical video game company that we'll talk about a little bit later. The only letters that I'm proud of, I'm proud of all of them, but I did get a master's in medical education, which was sort of my entree into video game-based learning, as well as technology-enabled learning, and so that's really what got me excited in this space, and what I talk about a lot of.
Great. Well, okay. Well, very nice to have you here, Eric, and thank you for joining the webinar tonight. And thank you to all of you for joining us, because honestly, the most important thing of any webinar is you guys who are participating and joining us from many places in the world, which we're about to find out very soon. Before we start, a special thanks to all the guys at Amy, especially Diana, who's gone out of her way organizing all this for us and making this happen. So Diana, great job for all the organization. Thank you very much. And let's maybe go into some disclosures. Eric, you wanted to mention something here?
Yeah, the only, obviously, I have a bunch of companies that I sort of work for or advise for, but I want to stress that none of them had any creative control, review, or influence on this presentation. There are copyrighted images that are included. These are for educational purposes only and are subject to copyright, so please don't copy them and tell people that they're yours. I do use some company names and examples. They're included just examples, not to be an endorsement or promotional in any way, so I wanted to make sure you all know that.
Great. And from my side, my disclosures is I like gaming. Nobody paid me for it, unfortunately, yet, but I do like gaming. Okay, great. So let's take a look at our objectives for today. So today we're going to be talking about some very interesting things. First, we're going to discuss about some of the underlying theories behind games, and then we're going to go ahead and talk about the role of games in an educational experience. We're going to talk about some of the advanced technologies that we're actually using in games to get people excited and interested. Also, we're going to talk about some current games in healthcare. We're going to be analyzing them in a little bit more depth as we go through our presentation today. And also, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of how we would enable a game as part of a learning experience. So hopefully we'll get some ideas and some thoughts on how can we actually get a game to be part of what we're doing every day. So welcome to all of you. I see Mary is here. She's also a wonderful expert in games. I do recommend, if you have a chance, Mary has written some great works in this area. So she's definitely a person to talk to. Okay, very good. So before we continue, if I can get you guys to please log into our poll everywhere. I'm going to share the link one more time and tell us, where are you coming from? Because we're really interested in figuring out where people are joining us from today. So I'm based in Taiwan. And Eric, you're in Chicago right now, is that correct?
I'm actually in New York, but yes.
Oh, you're in New York right now, okay.
Yep, States.
So let's see what we have so far. I see some people in North America. We have some people in Asia. That looks like Singapore over there. Hi, Singaporeans. I like you guys so much. We have some people joining in from Africa, Europe. So it seems like we're a pretty international crowd today. So very, very excited to see how this goes in our session. And hopefully we will be able to cover some interesting topics for you. But before we continue, we would like to know a little bit more about you. So we're very interested in knowing more about you. And I guess our next question is, what are your feelings towards games and education? So if you'd like to share with us, we'd love to know what comes to your mind when you think about games in education. Let's see. Here we can see the numbers coming out. Wow, we have several.
I love it. I love it.
That's awesome. Great. I don't feel.
We expect the gamers to add their expertise and areas of interest to this topic.
Okay, it seems like we don't have any A's yet. That's perhaps a good sign.
Okay, yeah, that's good. We don't have to convince anybody, so this is perfect.
Yeah, but look at the amount of people who love gaming. Like that's 50%. That's awesome. That's great. That's great. Awesome. And those of you who say you're not in you, that sounds interesting, but you're not sure, or who want to see the data, today is the day for you. We will definitely try to convince you by the end of our webinar tonight of how cool gaming is. Okay, great. Let's keep going. And then I guess the other question we had for you is we want to know about your gaming habits. So how often do you play games? And this, we're talking about any game. It could be a computer game, a board game, any kind of game you like.
Mobile game. We have a lot of mobile gamers now, especially with the pandemic.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I think the pandemic has driven a bunch of people into gaming. Well, we have some semi-pro gamers. That's pretty cool. Okay, we've got lots of often. Sometimes a couple of people don't play games. Hopefully, we will change your mind after today, and we'll get you gaming as well. So that if we run this next time, we would love to see 0 on the A side. But anyway, this is part of the experience. So again, please try things out. We're going to introduce you to several games. It's an invitation to go and download stuff and really kind of give it a go and try it out, because it's a very, very interesting area. Before we start today, I wanted to share a little story with you. And this is kind of a little bit of a personal story from my childhood, actually. So I've always loved gaming. I've had this fascination for games in all formats, especially video games. But interestingly enough, when I was a kid, I was not allowed to play video games. And it was horrible, right? Because all my friends were playing video games and talking about video games. I was not allowed to do so. I got a part-time job and I secretly saved money until I could buy my own game. And I used to hide inside my room, lock the door, and play some games without audio for the longest time while I was growing up. So yeah, that was kind of my first start into gaming. But then after that, after I got a bit older and I started studying medicine and I graduated, I actually really enjoyed playing games, but I was so embarrassed to tell people about it. I was like the secret gamer, and I was just terrified of people finding out that I'm into gaming. Fortunately, I think we've become a lot more tolerant, because before people would say, oh my God, how can you waste your time on games? But actually, we've discovered that games have a role in medical education. And I think that has really kind of invited many people to actually come out and just talk that they really enjoy games, and that we really want this to be an opportunity to learn more. So this is kind of a little bit of my background. I'm a big gamer. I love games. And especially if it's something we can learn from, there's so much to see into this field. So definitely a very, very exciting time for gamers or people who are interested in this kind of technology. So with that, talking about time, Eric, I want you to tell us a little bit about this slide here.
Yeah, so I think we're all here because we're all interested in finding out ways to reimagine how medical education could be taught. The days of somebody pontificating on stage and everybody just walking away and going home and studying and learning it is no longer the case. The wisdom isn't held by one person any longer. It's a distributed knowledge. Now, what we're really wanting to showcase is that when you have this type of experience, oftentimes people fall asleep. And so instead of having people disengage and just be talked at, we've realized the value of problem solving. And problem solving in games is part and parcel with how they are developed. And we're going to talk a lot about how problem solving is deliberately designed within games to keep you engaged, keep you learning, and keep you interested. And that's really where the secret sauce of games is.
Yeah, this brings a lot of memories. This picture over here, I remember suffering through this several times actually. And actually, let's take a look at this video because this really shows the skill level necessary to pull this off. Like if you
Yeah.
look into hand-eye coordination and memory, it's incredible.
And realize that the person who's playing this game didn't get dropped into this level. They've practiced this level thousands of times or levels before it. And just how people develop expertise through playing games is what's everybody's so excited about, how games can actually apply in many different domains, including medical education. And this is obviously lots and lots of hours in practice in order to be able to achieve this type of mastery in the game, as well as the ways that we can actually apply it within medical education and health professions education. Some of the ways that people are using it, so this is a high fidelity game, mobile game that you're actually used to try and take the nail out of a lung. And one of the things you'll see here is that this is a physics puzzle, but very quickly turns into what we call a real-time strategy game, where there's a nail in the lung and it actually starts bleeding from the site, and you actually have to manage both things at once. And so imagine how many times you have to practice this in order to get the best score, to be able to do this the right way. And this is, we'll talk about deliberate practice. We'll talk about all the ways that games can actually foster this educational knowledge and these skills through deliberate practice and many other things that we're going to talk about from a cognitive theory standpoint. One of the other things, yeah, go ahead.
Sometimes when I play the airway game, I start sweating. I start like sweating and then like I get really nervous with it. And it's interesting how you kind of forget it's a game and you're so deep into it that it's really this situation that's really hard to describe.
And one element that people don't always see is that the level of the music and the sound effects and how they actually build upon that. So we're talking about the reality of the sound. So we actually have pulse oximeter sounds that actually match the correct pitch that it would be in the OR. And so you actually have that visceral reaction that you would have in the operating room. And you actually have music that gets very intense that lets you know this is a very hard level or this is a very critical step. And those types of things, you don't realize how much that adds to the experience. Imagine a movie without a score. That's how these games are without music, and how education can actually be enhanced through the music and the environment. Another area of interest is Minecraft. So this actually is more of a sandbox environment. And so we're actually going to play this introduction to Minecraft for those who don't know or who don't have any kid. This is probably, I think, the #1 game of all time in consumer games. And basically the idea behind Minecraft is you're building things. And again, the idea of learning through construction is something we call constructivism. And constructivism, learning by doing and putting things together, is what Minecraft really does. And you understand how much people understand how the building blocks play off of each other, whether brick or stone, the types of materials that go in. And this lends itself very well to understanding through construction and how we can actually apply this in science education and medical education especially. The other thing about Minecraft, it's something we call a sandbox environment. In sandbox environments, you set your own goals within the game. And so again, playing to the adult learning principles of autonomy, you actually choose what goals you want to achieve. You choose what things you want to do, what things you want to get better at. And through that choosing, you actually create this world that is your own. And I think that's really kind of the interesting area that Minecraft can actually apply within science education, healthcare education. And some people actually have built things called mods. Mods are basically taking the base game, creating your own levels and your own things within the game. And people actually have used this because think about building materials like DNA, like proteins, all these things, organic chemistry, understanding covalent bonds, all these types of things can actually be learned through constructivism. And that learning by doing that is built within games is really what makes it very applicable in this space. And a friend of mine actually built Polycraft World, which was a mod, and he wanted to teach petrochemical processing. And you can see here how the students, this is actually integrated into their curriculum. And so we're going to talk a little bit later about how games can actually add or replace or transform your medical education and how it fits into curriculums. But understand the knowledge that these players have gained through playing this game, understanding how different materials are processed. And that is how he actually integrated this into the curriculum at University of Texas, Dallas. And what makes us so excited about this. And there's actually good proof that these skills actually transfer. And so keep letting your kids play games, but actually teaching through science and video games has actually shown ways that it can actually be a proof point that we can actually gain and retain knowledge and skills through playing video games. And we'll show some more studies later. What games is not, there's a term that has really been popularized in literature called gamification. Gamification as a term is fine in how it's being used. However, there is this level of gamification where people take superficial elements of video games, like badges, like competition, and they slap it onto a learning experience and expect engagement to change, motivation to change, and learning to change. And that's just not the case. That is what the secret sauce of video games is that we're going to talk about later. In this game, Math Blaster, you're actually just adding numbers to play a game. You don't really necessarily understand why you're doing it. You're just doing it over and over and over again without any overarching narrative or interesting things or interesting decisions that you're making. This is, I would say, what we call a bad example of the application of video games. In video games, we actually call this chocolate-covered broccoli. And the reason being is, can you move forward, Daniel?
Sure.
That's okay. So chocolate covered broccoli is the idea that on the outside, it looks really interesting and fun, but once you bite into it, then it's broccoli, and a lot of kids don't like broccoli. So that is the idea within video games, that you can take these superficial elements and apply it. However, it doesn't really transform the learning experience. And this is why game designers have jobs. This is why there's 200,000 people in the world working on games. This is why it's an almost $300 billion business, because it doesn't take anybody fly by night to add competition or badges. This is actually a very deliberate design using psychology, sociology, behavioral economics, a bunch of different very deep principles and theories that go into actually building these games.
These are really important elements, because what happens is games need to be fun, need to be attractive. And there's a lot we can learn from the gaming industry when designing these activities, because the gaming industry completely focuses on that and providing those user experiences and keeping people engaged and making people come back to the game. So it's really important to experience some of those games, so that when you start developing your own idea of a game or incorporating an existing game into your classes, you have a much better understanding of what are best practices in the industry for doing this. So it's really important to learn from other games when you're starting to think about your own games or integrating existing games into what you're doing. I see you've got Pokemon up here, Eric.
Yeah, Pokemon Go. So Pokemon
Yes.
Go came onto the scene in about 2016, and it hit the ground running. And the reason why we give Pokemon Go, besides the augmented reality, which is kind of interesting and fun, is sort of the outcome that happened from Pokemon Go. But the other things that you don't see, so a good friend of mine always said that there's a reason why you know 100 Pokemon characters and all their characteristics, and you don't know 40 US presidents, or for international audiences, you don't know 40 capital cities of countries. And it's because the stealth learning that happens, the learning that happened as an unintended consequence of fun. You're playing the game, you're trying to achieve the goal within game. However, the learning and the skills required to play the game are what you end up learning through playing the game. And so that's where the difference between a good game and Math Blaster is. The goal of this game is to capture these individuals. The goal of the constructivism game is to build these factories. However, in order for you to know how to do that, you have to develop these skills. And those are the skills that actually transfer to real life. But this stealth learning that happens in self-assessment, which we're not going to talk about today, but the stealth learning that happens is what's very amazing about video games, and why you can't just make up your own video game fly by night without actually having some reasonable thoughts on it.
Yeah, this went crazy. I'm not sure what happened in the US, but I remember I was in Japan at the time that this game came out, and I remember walking in a park, and it was actually impossible to walk because there were thousands of people capturing this special Pokemon that would only appear in that park, and they were like small kids. There were like older people. There were a couple grandparents in there, workers in suits with ties catching Pokemon. It was incredible to see how many people were actually drawn to this. It was just shocking. And learning all these details just by playing.
Absolutely. And there's actually people in the US that are almost hit by cars because they were in such a state of concentration that we'll talk about, the flow state that can be achieved through these video games, that they almost got hit by cars. Like it said, there's been over 1 billion downloads. This is a $757 million revenue from Pokemon Go. And the other thing that you realize is that its ability to do behavior change. And so my good friend who I talked about earlier always talks about how Pokemon Go overnight was able to get people off the couch and walking when there was millions of dollars invested in the US, at least, to get people active in this active 60 that really didn't take off. But Pokemon Go overnight had people walking. Again, the goal of the game wasn't to get people walking. It was an unintended consequence of the fun of the game. And so you can see here, as compared to non-players, just the first week after installation. Now it went a little bit lower, but that's as people sort of, as installs declined. But this is actually understanding how the game got people to do all these things. And then understanding the knowledge and skills that they had to obtain to play the game. Think about all the different aspects of the individual characters, about their individual health points, their different abilities, fire tech, water strike. And our kids know these when they play these video games, and adults who play video games also gain this knowledge that is required to play the game. Now imagine if this was protein synthesis, if this was DNA, if this was anything else, and the ability of the players to learn about the individual components in order to play the game. And we'll give you some good examples later on.
Yeah, one of the interesting things with this is the amount of information that people can actually absorb through the game. I think a really good analogy is like, you know, those really bad songs that you heard this song on the radio a couple of times and you memorized it and suddenly you caught yourself singing it all the time. So I think that's a really good analogy, how we can absorb huge amounts of information just because we're enjoying it or just because it's interesting at that time. And we're not really thinking about the effort that we're making to actually incorporate all this into our memory. So it's really, really interesting how much information can actually be absorbed through these different things.
And learn by doing, right? So the idea that you're actually putting this knowledge into practice, and that retrieval practice, which we don't talk about too much, but that retrieval practice is actually what solidifies the knowledge and increases your retention of knowledge, which is why you know these long after you ever stop playing the game. In psychology, there's a concept called the zone of proximal development. It was popularized by Lev Vygotsky in the 1970s. And we'll talk about the application within medicine, but within games, this is actually part and parcel with the experience. And it's the idea that as your abilities increase within a certain domain, in order for you to actually be able to stay in that zone of maximally efficient learning, the challenge has to go up. Remember that games are an opt-in experience. If you're too bored because the level is much lower than your skill, or the level is much higher and you're anxious and you're challenged and you're frustrated and you opt out, really games try to live in this zone of proximal development. And we'll talk a little bit later about what that concept is. But this is also synonymous with the term scaffolding. And so if you actually can scaffold your learners, think about a hint in a video game. You know, if you're playing a puzzle level and you ask for a hint, that is the scaffolding that's built in to get you past that area so that you continue playing the game. And these are very deliberately designed within the game. And we actually test people as they go in and out of the zone of proximal development. But the reason why this is so important is because this is where maximally efficient learning happens. This is where people create these flow states where they're very deeply engaged and maximally efficiently learning through this zone. In medicine, the way that I actually apply this is within surgery. So when I actually have a resident or a trainee come in, I don't assume their level of skill. Again, adult learning principles, people come in with their own knowledge and their prior knowledge. So I'll actually understand where they're at within their learning journey, regardless of what their year in training is. And then I give them a straightforward skill to see what their abilities are. And I actually fine tune that surgical experience to them. I let them struggle safely. It's extremely important, the struggle. The struggle is the problem solving. We'll talk about it later about how we actually deliberately design for that struggle. But we actually let them struggle safely and let them problem solve. If their problem solving gets to the point where they're not safe and not able to do it, then I will come in and I'll get them past that point within the surgery, and I'll hand it back to them to be able to do the rest of the surgery, again, until they come to that point. And over time, they're able to problem solve through that area that I help them, that scaffolding that I built in. But I don't take them off of their zone of proximal development. I try to continue them along that and just help them as it seems fit, but allow them to safely challenge at that upper level of their abilities.
Oh, sorry, I think we Go for it, Eric.
And in games, we talked about how this sweet spot, we call it the flow channel, and we'll talk about flow in a second. But the ability to get people into this flow state is deliberately designed within the video games. And the zone of proximal development from psychology applies within games. And James Paul G, if you haven't heard of him before, I strongly recommend him. I'll show you his book later. Changed the way that I think about education. It changed the way I think about knowledge and learning. And he talks about the regime of competence principle. And this is, again, very similar to the zone of proximal development, that if you keep people in this channel of continually up challenging them as they develop skills, and you deliberately design how the levels are built in order for them to attain the skills in order to play the boss case or the end of that level, then you can actually achieve that zone of proximal development, maximize their learning. And this is where, again, gamification really falls flat, is because it doesn't deliberately design for these difficulty curves. And these difficulty curves are very specifically designed for the player to learn as they go and to continue to challenge them. And again, games are an opt-in experience. So if they're too bored or they're too frustrated, they're going to stop playing, and you don't want that in an almost $300 billion industry. Dan, you were saying?
Yeah, so I was mentioning that, it's all about finding that balance, and sometimes when we're doing medical education, it's really challenging because we have learners that have different levels of competence and can accept different levels of difficulty, and sometimes it's hard to find that sweet spot when we're doing group teaching. Whether, for example, in games, because sometimes it's an individual activity or a small group activity, it's a lot easier to keep things challenging and interesting when people are playing. Shall we take a look at our next stop?
Yeah.
Let's skip this one. So this one here, this is again, this is a very, very, this hits home very much. So I used to play this game, and I remember how difficult and frustrating it was, right? So like being able to jump through these fire bars and skip everything and finally reach the goal was so challenging. And so many times, you were frustrated and angry and would lose your temper because you were not getting there. But eventually that pushes you to do things harder. And when you do reach that goal, it was just that feeling of wonderfulness and feeling accomplished and feeling great. And this to the point in which, we would actually share this with friends, right? We would go and show, oh, check out my high score, or I passed this level. And it was a whole matter of group celebration for this. So definitely games have that power to really, really push people and motivate them to do things that would probably be very difficult to do if you were just trying to learn separately as an educational activity.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that happens within games that we would like to achieve within medical education is the concept of flow. And Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi was a Hungarian-born psychologist who described flow state as a state in which people are so involved in activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience itself is so enjoyable that people will do it even at great cost for the sheer sake of doing it. So you see this ingrained intrinsic motivation to continue to learn. I think we've all achieved this in different facets of our life. And again, these flow states are very specifically designed in video games. And there's lots of ways that the flow state can actually be set up. We won't talk too much about it, but task-specific challenges, very specific setting, very specific feedback. All of these things try to achieve a flow state. And I think in medicine and in surgery and even in studying, we achieve this flow state where time literally just vanishes. We all remember times when we were kids, or if we have kids who play video games and it's 2 a.m, they didn't realize that they've been playing games for so long. And it's because the game's deliberately designed for this flow channel experience where that maximally efficient learning happens. And Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi noticed this in elite athletes and in musicians, that they've just achieved this greater state of concentration. And we've done that in surgery, we see that in medicine. But the question is how can we take the magic of games to design these flow channels and apply it to medical education? And we'll talk about it in a second. But you've all seen these esports, these people who are very, very focused, that literally nothing else is going on, and they can actually super hyper focus. And that's really the area that we're trying to achieve. And it doesn't matter the complexity of the skill. And so example here is actually the flight simulator. And the flight simulator is actually, it's so close to the actual experience. This is a very complex skill. We didn't talk too much about sensory inputs, but there's tons of sensory inputs that are happening here. And the player has to hyper focus on the relevant ones. And so you can actually see that flight simulators have been used for decades in the airline industry to train people how to fly. And you can see in this video game how realistic this cockpit is and how those skills would actually transfer to a simulator. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of these skills that are actually built into this game would transfer to actual life without having to actually do the flight simulator or be able to transfer to the real life cockpit. And I remember when I was a kid, I played Top Gun, and Top Gun was really hard. You had to land these F-16s on the aircraft carriers, and it was so hard. I tried for hours and hours and hours. And then the second you were able to do it, you had this huge excitement, this huge output of dopamine that really reinforced that learning. And you're like, now I know how to do it. And this level of reality, which we don't talk about too much, but level of reality and the ability to transfer these skills to real life actually matters in something like a flight simulator. There's another game called Kerbal Space Program that actually has real life physics from the aerospace industry that you can actually use to teach students about physics, about aerospace. And all the physics are actually real, and you're trying to get this shuttle off the ground and get these lemmings to the moon or do these other missions. And the physics are completely real. And so the students can actually learn by doing, and actually took the class that we actually use Kerbal Space Program to learn.
Yeah, one of the incredible things was this is that, you know, sometimes the people flying these airplanes are 10-year-olds or 12-year-olds, right? That have learned enough to actually understand how an airplane operates and are able to take off and to fly and to land. And a lot of these things are so close to the real life that it's incredible how even in a learner that we wouldn't is untrained, or we would expect to be unable to do such a complex task, they're able to do that through games, right? Because games offer that opportunity to make mistakes, to try again, right? To learn from all those small problems that you're having. And again, it allows people to develop incredible skills that you would not expect at all. That Kerbal game is also incredible. Like, they build rockets and they go to the moon. Very, very interesting. And a lot of this is very similar to what we do in simulation, right? So when in simulation, again, there are moments in which we create that flow in the simulation, in which the team is so engaged in the task at hand, and they're so hyper focused on what they're doing that they even forget that it's a mannequin. And the amount of stress and realism that they experience is just unbelievable, because they're so focused on task. Right. And I think that's something that games can really bring to reality.
And the power of games is even being used within the, if you can mute that, sorry.
I'm not sure where it left that. Oh, that's weird. Oh, sorry, let me see what happened. I had it sorted out. Oh, here we go. Let me just go away. No. Oh, that's so strange. It's not letting me mute it. Sorry.
Try on the right-hand side here. There's a mute button here.
Yeah, it's
on the right-hand side. It's on the right-hand side of the screen, bottom right.
There we go. Oh, okay, there we go. Yeah, got it. Oh, no.
Right side of the screen.
Right side of the screen, yeah.
Right bottom. When you go over it.
Oh, there we go. There we go. Got it. Sorry about that.
Perfect.
Sorry, everybody.
And just hit for me.
Just play that again. Go for it.
So the idea of the power of games and this flow state, this ability to concentrate, is actually being used in the digital therapeutic space. In the US, there's actually been the first FDA-approved video game to actually treat a medical condition. This is Achille Interactive's Endeavor RX. And it takes advantage of those flow states that can be achieved through games and that concentration to actually treat patients with ADHD. And this was actually better than the medication use within these patients. And obviously, it's much more interesting and fun as well. And so I think the idea of actually video games as a use case outside of even education as these digital therapeutics is a very exciting area. And in fact, they're using some of the Achille products to actually diagnose Alzheimer's. They're actually using it for COVID brain fog. There's lots of different use cases for video games. And Dan, you have a couple others as well.
Yeah, for example, right now in virtual reality, they're using simple games to distract people during minor procedures. And they're actually able to administer less analgesia during these small surgical procedures by getting people to play games while they're engaged in it. For this, they've been using virtual reality, and they just put on the headset and they're just transported to a different setting, and they're doing a specific task, right? And they get into the flow, and they actually forget that they're in the middle of the surgery. So it's very, very fascinating, the power of these things to really transform the way we perceive the environment and get us super focused on what we're trying to learn or to accomplish at the moment.
And in education, we talk about the idea of desirable difficulties. In games, James Paul G calls this pleasant frustration. And so it's this idea of keeping people at the top of their zone of proximal development and keeping them difficult. If they're not struggling, they're not learning. This is where the maximally efficient learning happens. They have to struggle to learn. And this is why doing the same thing over and over again or rereading an article is actually not as efficient as having you actually write out your own interpretation of what you read. It's much harder, and that difficulty is actually what allows the learning to be retained, the knowledge to be retained long after you've ever experienced it. This is why highlighting and rereading does not work from it when it comes to studying. But that's how games actually keep people progressing. They keep this flow state by making it just difficult enough for you to actually maximize your skill development. And I take this when I actually teach trainees in the operating room. I talk about it, that I actually give them challenging things in order for them to do, because I know that in order for them to maximize their learning while they're with me, that I need to keep them at the edge of their abilities. And there's an analogy from boxing called line, speed, beauty, and I use this in my medical education. Line is understanding the steps of the procedure or the steps of things that are needed to be taken. Speed obviously is efficiency in education. We want to maintain quality. And the last is beautiful, making it look easy. And in surgery, this is what we try to do, is I teach them the skills needed to actually understand the natural flow of the procedure. I don't stop once they're able to do it. Then I work on efficiency. What can we do to make you more efficient? And then last, how do I make it look easy? Hold the instrument this way. It'll be way easier. You're not going to be back throwing the stitch. It's going to make it look way easier. And I'm just constantly pushing them at the edge of their abilities to continue to move them forward and try to achieve mastery instead of competency.
And well, the other thing is reward people, right? We give them
Absolutely.
the great, the stars, the whole thing to kind of make people feel fantastic once they reach that point of success. And that
Correct.
keeps people, that need for reinforcement, for immediate feedback on their performance is critical to getting people involved in focused.
Absolutely. And obviously games are really good at understanding the balance between reward and frustration in order to keep people going. You have to have those rewards, those dopamine releases. Think about a slot machine when the slot machine's going, and how much that reward is when you actually hit it. And slot machines are known to be one of the most compelling things on earth, which is why we have Gamblers Anonymous, because people get so compelled to do that because the reward is so much worth the experience of actually losing money that we actually keep going. In fact, in surgery, I actually allow them to do the end of the procedure before I allow them to do the beginning. And the reason being is because they actually get rewarded by finishing the surgery much more so than starting the surgery and getting it taken away. And so I actually allow them to finish the surgery and then slowly move back into the beginning of the surgery in order to achieve that reward that you would feel otherwise in games. And one example here actually is, this is an interventional cardiology game. And this again goes from where simulation and games actually differ. In games, you actually have this ability to abstract a certain skill. Again, these are very difficult, almost unforeseen things where you'd have like 5 lesions in a coronary artery, or you'd have these explosions. That ability to abstract in games actually allows us to better engage the learners, because they're doing something interesting, something very specific. But then they're allowed to do it over and over and over again, thousands of times, before they actually have to do this in real life. And this is where games differ a little bit from simulation. Simulation is often very focused on realism. Games are abstraction of realism, and it gives you this affordance to be able to do these interesting things that they otherwise wouldn't do. However, you're still developing the same skills that would transfer into real life. In this game, the hard part is not actually navigating the wire. The hard part is actually managing and deciding what is the best management when we have 5 lesions, or we have explosions, or we have 3 things going on at once. Again, these rare occurrences that are highly acute that can happen in real life, which is where simulation really starts to play. And the idea here is that deliberate practice. And so when I was a trainee, we used to do these very, very high-risk surgeries called stapedectomies. And you're basically trying to make a very, very millimeter-sized hole and then actually put a small prosthesis. And if you mess up, you will the person will be deaf. If you do it well, then the patient will hear. And it's a very, very high-risk procedure. And my chair used to make me practice 50 times with a cadaver the night before the procedure, regardless of how many times I did it. Every single time I had to practice 50 times. And he said, when you sit down to operate, I will know if you actually practiced or not. And this is the old 10,000 hour rule that, not necessarily everybody can achieve mastery in 10,000 hours, and it's not just going through the motions. This is actually deliberately trying to achieve mastery through practice. And this is trying to make yourself better and better and better. And I think in video games, Dan, you talked about playing that Super Mario level. Imagine how many times people practiced. We do have a question from Angela Strain. How about tabletop game models? We're going to talk a little bit about some of the tabletop games here in a second. Gamification in dentistry. Jafar, thank you so much. We'll talk a little bit about that towards the end, about not just video games, but how regular tabletop games or board games can actually achieve very similar results. And we have some practical examples for you, Angela. In medicine, obviously the first face transplant that happened, the full face transplant, imagine how much deliberate practice these surgeons and this operating room went through. This is where simulation really, really plays well, is your ability to practice this over and over and over again in order to achieve that final skill, which is doing the face transplant, which you get one shot and that's it. In simulation, Dan, you can talk about this.
Yeah, so in simulation, I think a lot of these principles are very similar. I think some of you were mentioning that there are some big differences with video gaming in which in simulation, we try to imitate reality as much as we can. When in gaming, sometimes we can create a different reality, right? In which some of these same skills can be learned. But again, many of these principles, for example, of setting the challenge level for the simulation, of deciding the level of complexity, or maybe even modifying the simulation as people are performing, are really interesting ways in which we make things into a better learning experience. So it's really important. I think many of these principles are not exclusive to games. They're transferable and applicable to many, many types of learning. And I think what we need to do is we need to see gaming as one more tool that is based on the same principles we're already using in other types of learning that we can apply and use in a way that can provide us really good results.
And deliberate practice in games is, the level 99 within Tetris, or that last level in Super Mario Brothers. The amount of times you've had to train in order to achieve that. And video games do this very well. And here's actually an example of Guitar Hero. So if anybody's ever played Guitar Hero, this gets extremely difficult at the end. And this actually ability to watch people show their mastery is actually an entire industry within games. People actually pay to watch people. These people make over $1 million a year, just having people watch them play. Just that demonstration of expertise is fantastic. But imagine how many times this guy has had to play this level in order to achieve this mastery, and look how concentrated he is. And he actually makes it look easy. Again, line, speed, beauty, right? And so this is actually a very good example of where mastery can be showcased through deliberate practice.
Yeah, and the interesting thing with these types of setups in which people are paying to watch others play games very well, right? And that's really interesting, because I think that's something that before we wouldn't have really imagined too much. But we're at a point, and I think with younger generations coming up, and they're much more interested in these kind of activities, and they really admire that mastery, watching that master perform at the top of his ability, right? And they get rewarded, and they receive tips, and they receive subscriptions, and they get a bunch of different rewards. And sometimes they're making like millions of dollars a month, right? By just playing games on the internet. So very, very interesting things that you can observe.
And so, you know, I think in games, and even in the medical realm, there's a company called Grendel Games that actually use laparoscopic instrumentation to play an adventure game. This is an endless runner adventure game. You're actually building bridges. You're actually trying to get your character to the other side of the virtual environment, and you're actually using laparoscopic instruments in order to achieve that. And again, here the goal of the game is to get your character on the other side, and you're having to use the laparoscopic instruments in order to achieve that goal. So you learn hand-eye coordination, you learn all of the different instrumentation in order to play the game. The game here is not moving things using laparoscopic. You have to do that in order to achieve the game. There's actually laparoscopic simulators and robotic simulators that are very focused on moving things from one place to another. That's not as fun as this, right? I mean, the idea here is that the game goal is actually tangential to the skills being developed. However, you need to develop the skills in order to play the game.
Yeah, by the way, those are the controllers in the bottom right. That little image that was there in the bottom right, those are the controllers for that game.
Peggy 7.
Yeah, we're gonna skip that for time. I want to make sure we have time for questions because there's a bunch in the chat. The other idea here is that this is the Russell and Feldman Barrett circumplex model of emotion. And on the top, you hear activation. This is deactivation. On the left is unpleasant and pleasant. And in medical education, there's an old way of learning called pimping. And the reason why pimping still works is because it's in this activating state. Again, talking at somebody is very deactivating. However, actually talking with them and having them converse is much more activating. However, pimping actually lives in this negative valence, in the unpleasant activation, and it still works because it's an activating process. Games entirely live in this pleasant activation. This is much more where we'd like to be. And somebody actually talked about tabletop games. And again, these tabletop games, just like the Pokemon Go, you have to learn these skills in order to achieve the goal within the game. That's not specific to video games. That's any game. The fundamentals of games is you're given interesting decisions to make and given near immediate feedback about the outcome of those decisions, and then you're allowed to make decisions again. Think about a card game. Think about any game that you've ever played, that the amount that you've learned and the ability to actually replay those steps. And so I think we'll give you some examples about board games. We're going to skip through some of the video games, but I don't think I need to belabor with this audience that games is a huge industry. That games skills you learn in the game actually do transfer to real life. And those aren't limited to the mechanical and psychomotor skills. There's strategy, there's leadership, teamwork, communication, empathy, diligence, persistence, others. And this is not specific to video games. This is any game. Think about all of these different skill sets that are learned. Think about leadership if you're doing some kind of collaborative game. There's a game called Pandemic that actually became very popular at the beginning of the pandemic, believe it or not. So much so that they had to come out with an official statement that they are not predicting the outcome of the pandemic by playing the game Pandemic. But think about the leadership and the teamwork and the communication that has to go into playing that board game. And think about empathy and when we have very narrative-driven games. And think about strategy. Obviously, things like Stratego, things like chess, just the involvement of strategy in order to achieve that. But the best games that actually happen within medical education are based on these very principles of the game core loop. The game core loop, like capture the flag, is a game core loop. Competition and badges are sort of superficial to that, which we talked about. But the strategy, the need, real-time strategy we talked about. Real-time strategy is trying to do things in real time when you have multiple things. Think Diner Dash was a really good example of that. But these aren't limited to video games, and I want to underline that because a lot of people have actually asked about that specifically. So where's the evidence? So a lot of people want to know, where do the skills transfer? The bottom line is let your kids play video games. The hand-eye coordination, there's actually evidence that people got better with hand-eye coordination during laparoscopic surgery when they were a gamer as a child. And it's because these skills that are happening within the game are actually transferring to real life. And not only are we using games to actually teach them, but even completely disembodied from the actual skill, those skills transfer, which is the example that I have, which in the video game with laparoscopic surgery. The top left, Gridlocked, is actually a board game to those who are asking about board games. And in this game, you're actually managing an ER, the flow through an emergency room, and trying to understand the interplay interplay between different elements that happen with an emergency room and try not to get gridlocked. This is Teresa Chan's board game. Dan, did you ever other thoughts about that?
Yeah, so we use gridlock in the ER. So when we have like slow times in the ER, we actually set up the board game, and we play together with the residents and the students who are on call that night. And yeah, it's a great learning experience. There's a lot of skills that you wouldn't really associate to a game, like for example, as you were mentioning, leadership or teamwork or collaboration. So these are things that sometimes really surprise you, that can be very well learned from a gaming environment. The other thing is, I think it also teaches a lot about working as a team and being social with others, like how to interact with other people, how to support somebody who made a mistake, right? All of these are skills that you can pick up from these gaming experiences. So whether it's a board game or a computer game or whatever you're using, there are a bunch of skills that are not very explicit that you can acquire from these experiences.
And honestly, like even tabletop games or PC-based simulations can actually teach empathy. There's something called the poverty simulator that actually has you understand things that people are going through on a day-to-day from a social determinants of health. And so I think those games, and there's actually Pablo, who's in Boston, actually created a video game in VR for social determinants of health. And again, these narrative-driven games where you get involved and you empathize with the individual characters. And when your virtual character has something bad happen to them, you actually feel it in your own soul. And so those narrative-driven games, whether it be even a board game, think about the game of life. You know, when in the game of life, when you lost your money or you lost your job, you actually felt bad for the character, right? And so these non-player characters, the NPCs, and your characters actually can have the same empathy, and that's where it's actually being used for social determinants of health. And in fact, the video game industry and the actual medical industry are actually fusing. On the right is actually the robotic simulator controller. And you can see they borrowed from the Xbox controller because the Xbox controller was so intuitive and people were so used to it that they said, why reinvent the wheel? Let's actually create a remote that actually mimics. We talked about James Paul G, and if you get nothing else from this talk, I strongly recommend reading this book, even if you're not a fan of video games. This book taught me a lot about domain-specific education and just education in general. And there's so many principles, Dr. Romani talked about it in the chat, there's so many principles from video games that actually transfer to medical education as a whole, or education as a whole. It doesn't have to be limited to this. This ability to challenge people, this ability to keep people within that zone of proximal development, maximizing the learning while the time you have them. And James Paul G's books and all of his stuff has been very inspirational to me, and I strongly recommend reading it. So tangible examples. So some people asked about tangible examples. So this is a very simple video game. This is called Septress. This was developed out of Stanford. And the basic mechanic here is on the left-hand side, you see these characters that are slowly drifting down towards the bottom, which means that they're not doing medically well. As you make decisions, you order tests, you answer questions, and you actually manage them, they actually start to float towards the top. And the goal of the game is to actually obviously keep the characters alive. And through this game, you actually understand the management of sepsis and the management of SIRS. And you can do this over and over and over again. This is the benefit of games, is this is a safe environment to learn. Excuse me, and again, these knowledge and skills will actually transfer to real life, but it doesn't have to be super high-end graphics. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to be a coder or a gamer to develop these games. There's very simple solutions that you can do. I use branching logic all the time, and branching logic helps, again, a very game-based. You can even do trivia. I mean, any types of these games have some of these principles built in, and that's how people learn.
Yeah, I'd like to mention a little bit about this one. I actually use this game for teaching. So this game is a game designed to develop clinical skills, especially clinical reasoning skills. And it's really interesting. On the first scene has a history and has a physical findings, some physical examination information. Once you have that, you develop a couple of hypotheses as what could be going on. And then it takes you to the next page in which you actually have to choose which investigations are necessary. And if you choose one that is unnecessary, it will tell you you chose an unnecessary investigation, even if they give you the result. And then you choose the right investigations here, and then it takes you to the next stage where you have to decide on, you need to make some treatment or management options. And then you decide again how to do this. And then finally, at the end, you get some feedback about your performance, what you decided correctly or incorrectly. And it also gives you references to papers talking about these particular topics if you want to expand further into them. We actually use this as a group. So I put it up on the screen and I sit together with my students and we start deciding what we're going to do. And, you know, the conversations that develop around this are incredible. And it's probably one of the lowest tech games that you can encounter. All you have to do is click a couple buttons and make a couple choices. But there's so much potential depending on how you apply this game to the learning settings.
Absolutely. And we're going to use a couple other examples here. So another example here is Empiric. So we didn't talk about tabletop games as much, but you can see here, this game was actually developed by Michael Casamini. And this is actually to try to teach antibiotics. And so you actually understand the different antibiotics and how they work in different settings. So you can see pediatrics and emergency medicine. And this is through a card game. Again, these can be paper prototypes. These can be literally, when Michael first made this, it was literally a piece of paper that he used to play this game. Does not have to be high end, but the same principles apply. It has to be interesting decisions. They have to have near immediate feedback. There has to be some game loop that actually allows them to go over and over again. And the replayability is actually part and parcel with how the game actually develops. A friend of mine is developing a simulator, and I talked to him about the ability of chance. And chance actually maximally increases the replayability of the game if you actually have chance. So for example, the number of cards you draw and the type of cards you get actually introduce chance into the game. And so you have a different hand and you can actually manage the game differently, and it increases the replayability.
Now, Eric, sorry, there's a question in the chat from Elizabeth. What apps where I can learn about this interactive clinical case studies? The name of the app, Elizabeth, is Prognosis, Your Diagnosis. So it's Prognosis, Your Diagnosis, and it's a free app. So you can just download it to your phone or to your iPad. It's completely free, and again, you hook up your iPad or phone to a projector, and you've got a class going based on the game. So it's really interesting.
And there's Clinical Sense also from the same company that they came out with. Clinical Sense.
That's more advanced. That's more like the president level.
There's another question in the chat. Do you have any recommendations for any books and references on gamification in medical education? And so absolutely, I think, again, trying to understand the principles of games is important. James Paul G is very good. There's another book that we'll put out, which teaches about narrative-driven games. There's lots of stuff that's actually coming out in the literature that's about these use cases. There's studies on these individual products and how they actually performed. There's lots of stuff that's starting to come out. There's actually some AMI representatives here that actually have some good studies that are coming out about the use cases. I think Teresa Chan's group, who's done several different games, including Friday Night on the ER and Gridlocked, again, have published lots of studies on these, and these are all available in PubMed. So I strongly recommend reading them and understanding how they use the different game mechanics within these games. And Friday Night in the ER is, again, trying to understand flow through a hospital. So you can see surgery, you can see emergency, step down, and understanding how things flow. This is used for administrators to understand, why are we having problems? Why are we having patients build up in certain places? And just understanding how this sort of plays through.
Yeah, and Eric, just one more thing to throw out there. So look, the theory is important and it's great to read about it, but I think it's also important to play. To step out of your comfort zone and just try it out, just experience it and then see how you feel using it. And that gives you a whole new understanding of how gaming works in education, because if you don't really experience it, it's always going to be kind of at a very abstract level, and you're not going to understand how these principles actually look to the person who's playing the game. So I do encourage you, get some games and play, and that will really, really clear many of the questions that you might have, and will probably put you in a path to understand how your learners feel about this. A couple of things that I also want to maybe share with you today is, how do we actually go from learning about gamification or learning about games and actually bringing those games into a class or into a learning activity? So games can be used in a very, very wide range of ways. For example, one is we can use single player games. So this, for example, we can ask the students or ask our learners to download a game or play the game by themselves. And then they can share, for example, they can share their scores or they can share other information about the game. Sometimes they do little screenshots of their successful completion of a case, and they'll send that over by social media. So this is one way you can use them. The other way is you can have actually collaborative gaming, which is peer-led. So these are groups of students who engage together with a particular game, and they play together as a group, right? And then they achieve their results as a group, sharing their ideas, learning from each other. The other way that we can do it is also faculty-led. So, for example, is getting the faculty involved in the game as well, so the students can actually team up with you to start using the game together and to come up with, how you're going to solve this problem, or what is the diagnosis of this case, or how does it work. So this kind of collaborative learning is a really, really good opportunity as well. Other types of learning that we can do if you want to do something a little bit more on a massive scale, for example, competitive multiplayer is another really interesting mode. Usually many games can have scoreboards, or you can actually create your own scoreboard by getting the students to share their scores. And there's a leader, and people compete to get there. Actually, I use this sometimes with my students, and many times, we have the class, and they'll contact me a couple of months later just to show me that they beat my top score. So it's really interesting to see how competition can really get people excited about the game. And then the other part is we can also do cooperative multiplayer games. So there's several games that allow you to work. Oh, hi guys, please Zoom, mute yourself if possible. Thank you. And then we have cooperative multiplayer games, and these are games in which people work together towards accomplishing a common task, right? And we can see several of these types of cooperative multiplayer. For example, board games tend to fall very much into this category. The other thing we need to understand from gaming is that not all games are equal. Games have different balance of entertainment and education, and cognitive effort is related to that balance. So for example, we have games of unintentional learning in which there's a lot of entertainment and the education kind of happens in an unexpected way. And this is the good example, for example, Pokemon, right? So when people play Pokemon, we know they just want to capture the Pokemon, but they're really learning and memorizing all these stats and types for each Pokemon and how the Pokemon develop or evolve into something else. So there's a lot of unintentional learning in that type of gaming. The other type that we can find is to learn by playing. And this is when we have a balance between the entertainment and the educational side. So it's still a game and we enjoy it, but when we play, we learn. And this is where, for example, some of these level X games fall into this category quite nicely, because, they're all games, they're still games, but the idea is, you enjoy the game and at the same time, you're learning real skills. So it's kind of another interesting type of game. And then the last one we have is reality as a game. And this is where more of these kind of simulator type, like we talked about the flight simulator, or sometimes we have VR simulators for procedures or these type of things fall into this last category, in which the entertainment is less, right? There's still some entertainment value, but it's less. But the big focus is on the educational side. And again, as you progress through these games, you'll find that the cognitive difficulty or the cognitive effort of the player becomes higher because there's a higher learning content. But for example, also as players progress, or people who have higher skills usually will benefit more from a higher education into the mix. So whenever you're trying to apply a game into your teaching or into your activities, it's really important to understand the game. And this is why I tell you to play it, to try it out, so that you can really gain that understanding and see how that game needs to fit in to what you're doing from the educational standpoints. Okay, Eric.
So we're at time, so I want to make sure we get some of the questions. So a bunch of people had some really good questions. So I'm going to ask you, Dan. What are some of the barriers to games and gamification?
Well, I mean,
challenges, Yurko Barakal, what are some of the current challenges and limitations for implementation of gamification at all levels of education?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a tough one to answer as well. But for example, a couple of the things you need to be really careful is that the game has to be integrated into a learning framework. because if it's just a game, then people just play and that's it. That's all that's going to happen. So if you want to use games for education, it needs to be integrated into a learning process so that it can really provide that learning experience and to really kind of develop skills that are useful later on. So again, I think the integration is the most important thing. If you're going to use a game with your class, have a plan on how you're going to use that game. Usually I try to incorporate them into an experiential learning cycle in which, we play the game, then we discuss about how we performed or what were the good things or mistakes that we made. Then after that, we make some conclusions based on that. And then we plan for the next time we play. What are we going to do different to make this better or to perform better? So again, that is a very, very interesting way of putting games into the learning. And games offer that opportunity of unlimited replayability, right? Because you can play the game, you can start it again, and you're back to square zero and you get a chance to do things one more time. So these are kind of some of those areas that we need to be careful. Integration into a feasible educational framework is essential for games to be successful in class or in education.
Diana Fu asks, what is the typical project time frame to develop a game? It highly variable depending on whether it's a board game, whether it's a video game. This could be anywhere from weeks to months to years. A AAA game, like a Call of Duty or something like that takes like 3 to 5 years. One of the games that our company makes takes about, 8 to 12 months, depending on the type of game. But once you build the framework for the game, it's very easy to scale it. And so you want to actually develop games that can scale very quickly. And so that's actually one of the interesting areas, is that investment of something really sound, again, borrowing from the existing. So match 3 games. Match 3 games, there's about 1,000 match 3 games. Those are the Candy Crush, right? So Candy Crush has been downloaded by millions of people. But the concept of match 3 is not new. And there's lots of games that can go off of that. So if you have any skill or knowledge gap that requires people to put 3 things together or 4 things together, think about a match 3 game. It's very simple. It's a very foundational mechanism that has been reproduced lots and lots of times. Puzzle games, think about the ways that puzzle games can actually do that. Order of operation things, anything that's an order of operation, think about a puzzle game. Again, going back to Dan's thoughts, is really understand the gap that you're trying to address, and then understand the skills that are required, the knowledge that's required to fill that gap, and understand, is there any existing game types that require that type of knowledge or that type of skill? And that's where you should focus first.
Yeah, and if you are planning to do your own game, the best advice I can give you is play games, play several different games, and you're going to get ideas on how to design your own game so that it works well. For example, we design a lot of procedural trainers in virtual reality. It's one of the areas that I work in. And a lot of those design ideas actually come from playing video games because you start understanding how people interact and how people use the environment and how the people interact with the interface, and then it's a lot easier for them to be able to participate. So I do encourage you, if you are planning to teach with games, make games, or use games, it's really important to just try different things and get into it, and not only medical games, but different types of games, so you can gain a better understanding of how games work and what they can do for you and your learners.
Mary Dankbar asks, considering the high cost to develop a game, what skills in the curriculum would you recommend to develop a game for? So, going back to sort of Kern's 6 steps, really start with what the gaps are. And there's a RAT model there. Replace, amplify, and transform is the model of how we should use technology. It's the same how we should use games. Not every skill or knowledge gap is going to be addressed by games. If something can be learned by reading a PDF or watching a 10-minute PowerPoint, that's not necessarily the right thing to use technology or VR or games for. However, it's a very difficult concept that can be reduced down to different little elements that build together, or you can do constructivism or those types of things. Those are the things that you do want to develop. You can develop games for. Not all games are high cost. Again, I put in the chat something called Twine. Twine is a very easy branching logic concept that you can use for any kind of case-based study or any kind of question-based study, that you can actually have people choose their own adventure. So remember, choose your own adventure books and choose your own adventure games. play very well into medical education. That's completely free. Unity, which is a very powerful game engine, is free. These don't have to be high cost. If you want to hit a very high quality bar, make it look professional, then yes, it can be very expensive. But look at Septris. Septris did a very simple concept with not great graphics, and it turned out very, very well, versus some of the other folks that really hit the high end. But really, there's a huge spectrum. You can do paper prototypes. You can build your own board game. These do not have to be expensive. What's foundational is understanding where the gap is and how games and the game mechanic can fill that gap.
Okay, Eric, I'm sorry to have to call our party to an end, but I have received a notice that our time is up for today.
Yes.
So again, I would really like to thank all of you for the awesome questions, your participation. It was really a lovely opportunity for us to share with some things that we're passionate about, and do connect with us. We love collaborating with people. We love meeting people, and we'd love to hear from you and hear what are your ideas and your thoughts, or maybe some of the challenges that you're facing through the use of games in education. So please do reach out, connect with us. We use social media, or we use all kinds of different types of ways to communicate. So please do reach out, and we'd love to get to know you better. Also, we will be at the next AMI conference, right, Eric?
Hopefully.
So, if you want to meet in person, we'd love to meet you in person at the conference. And again, thank you again for your attention. And Eric, thank you so much for sharing all that expertise with us today and those amazing examples. And if you guys haven't, I do encourage you to check out some of the games that Eric's company does, because they're just amazing. So thank you all, and please stay safe. And thank you again for joining us. Eric, do you have any final words?
No, thank you so much for joining. Please, there's lots of great questions in the chat. Here's our contact information. There's a QR code that you can also contact me through. But please email us. We'd love to follow up on some of these questions. Great questions, and great ideas. And so, yes, thank you, Daniel. Daniel put in the chat, serious gamification for health.net. Lots of really great things happening. Lots of companies are doing really creative things. And again, underlying Daniel's thing is just play them. Just understand where people are coming from and how they're addressing these problems in a novel way. And that's really what excites me and keeps me going.
Definitely. Okay, everybody, thank you very much. And please have yourself a great day or morning or evening or wherever in the world you're joining from.